Lives of Great Men, a new series on great leaders in human progress, presented by Dr. Edward Howard Griggs, distinguished lecturer, critic, and author of Beauty in Nature and Art, and many other books. In these talks, Dr. Griggs is building a story of civilization based on outstanding characters through the ages, and how each one influences his own in future times. This evening, Dr. Griggs will discuss Jefferson, philosopher of democracy. We present Edward Howard Griggs.
My friends, the careers of Jefferson and Hamilton centered in the making of our government, and in them appears that first cleavage of political philosophy which divided our country for many decades and culminated in the Civil War. Jefferson's Welsh-descended father was of great physical vigor and liberal mind. Though dying when Jefferson was but 14, he was the first strong influence determining his son's lifelong liberalism in politics and religion. Contrasting with several of our greatest men, Jefferson had thorough schooling. At 17, he entered William and Mary College, the mother of so many important leaders, and proved equally capable in languages, mathematics, and science, becoming eventually the most broadly cultivated of all the fathers of our country. Soon after entering college, he was honored by the invitation to be the fourth in a group of eminent men who dined together several times a week, including Governor Faulkner, Dr. Small, the foremost liberal scholar in Virginia, and Wythe, leader of the bar. Their conversation was of high value in Jefferson's education, and Dr. Small became the second strong influence confirming his liberalism. Leaving college at 19, Jefferson studied law 5 years with Wythe and began practice with immediate success. Through 7 years at the law, he doubled his inherited fortune. 6 of those years he served in the Virginia Assembly. His personal life was established by his marriage with the lovely young widow Martha Skelton, gifted in music, to which he also was devoted. Soon after his wedding, he drove with his bride 100 miles west to the home he had begun building 2 years before at Monticello. The little mountain rises 600 feet above the countryside, with marvelous views across the rolling hills to the majestic Blue Ridge. Jefferson was his own architect, constructing the mansion on classic lines, Doric columns rising its full height. Jefferson's marriage was exceptionally happy during the 10 years of his wife's life. Only 2 daughters of his 6 children grew up to maturity, the elder becoming the mother of 11 children. It is interesting that the father's chief anxiety was to have his daughters acquire the manners and culture of gentlewomen. The great Democrat was distinctly an aristocrat in personal life. Monticello, remote from the settled part of Virginia, was even more than Mount Vernon, a little world to itself. All the bricks for the mansion were made by slaves on the estate. Jefferson brought better breeds of animals from Europe, introduced rice culture in the South, practiced rotation of crops, a great advance in farming. Though owning slaves, Jefferson was bitterly opposed to slavery, saying of it, "Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." The death of Jefferson's father-in-law brought him 40,000 more acres of land, with 135 slaves, again doubling his property. This was not an unmixed blessing, as there was a heavy mortgage, which in the end Jefferson paid several times over, collecting the money in our depreciated currency and paying it in gold at London. Jefferson was a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, and in May 1776, Virginia passed resolutions of independence, sending a copy to the Congress, asking that it take similar action. Jefferson was appointed on the committee and requested by the other members to draw up the Declaration. He spent 18 days at the task. His draft, accepted by the committee, was bitterly attacked in Congress, but with some changes was finally adopted and signed traditionally on July 4th. Jefferson thus became the author of the birth charter of our nation. It is now the fashion among smart cynics to call the Declaration of Independence a tissue of glittering generalities. Rightly understood, that is just what it is, a fabric of shining general truths, the only basis on which men can widely unite. Had Jefferson done nothing else when write the Declaration, his fame as philosopher of democracy would have been amply warranted. In the autumn of 1776, Congress asked Jefferson to go to France with Franklin, but his wife's illness caused his return home. Elected to the legislature, he was appointed to revise the Virginia statutes. That work was of supreme importance, not only to Virginia, but for the nation. He succeeded quickly in eliminating the laws entailing estates on eldest sons, thus ending the development of a Virginia landed aristocracy. Gradually, he substituted a just and liberal penal system for the barbaric one then in force. His bills provided for a complete state system of education and for the elimination of slavery. Of these measures, he achieved only the prohibition of further importation of slaves into Virginia and the later founding of the university. The most important item, won through a 10 years fight, was the abrogation of the vicious colonial laws on religion, replacing them with his great statute on religious freedom, which reads, "Be it therefore enacted by the General Assembly that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship place or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or beliefs, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities." That is not the earliest statute on religious freedom in our country, but is one of the noblest, and through Jefferson's prestige and influence, helped to give us a similar guarantee in those first amendments to the Constitution forming our Bill of Rights. Jefferson thus became the father of American religious freedom. And in a day such as this, with worldwide revival of religious intolerance and persecution, we need, as never before, to return to his great ideas and follow them. In the darkest period of the war, Jefferson served 2 terms as governor when Virginia was ravaged by British troops. He narrowly escaped capture at Monticello, fleeing by an underground passage as the British came over the brow of the hill. Elected to Congress, Jefferson drafted the law for the government of the Northwest Territory, providing in it that slavery should cease there from the beginning of 1800. Finally adopted by the Congress, this made Union victory possible in the Civil War. His original bill further provided that slavery should cease in the Southwest Territory at the same date. This Congress rejected. Had it carried, there would have been no Civil War. In 1784, Jefferson was again asked to go to France. His wife had died in the meantime, and he accepted, soon succeeding Franklin as ambassador. His 5 years in Paris were happy. His culture made him welcome at the court of the last King Louis, but alone among our statesmen, he was able to see the true meaning of the French Revolution. Shortly after the fall of the Bastille, he came home, permanently loving France, but wholeheartedly American. He remarked to Monroe that to love one's own country, one should live abroad a while. Advice as good today as when Jefferson gave it. Reluctantly, he accepted appointment as Secretary of State in the first cabinet, but was increasingly alarmed at the growing power of the federal government fostered by Hamilton with Washington's sanction. Jefferson believed in the least central government consistent with law and order. Hamilton wanted the strongest government consistent with liberty. At the close of 1793, Jefferson resigned and went home to Monticello. In 1796, the largest electoral vote was for John Adams for president, the next for Jefferson. As the Constitution then provided, this made Jefferson vice president. During his term, he devoted himself to organizing the opposition to the Federalist policies, thus founding the first political party to be consciously formed. He called it Republican, in contrast to the monarchical, as he stigmatized the Federalists. It was afterwards named Republican Democratic and finally Democratic. It has had the longest life of any political party in America, and although called dying some years ago, recently took office with the largest majority given in decades. During Adams' administration, there was threat of war with France, and the Federalists passed the vicious Alien and Sedition laws. Jefferson wrote protesting resolutions passed by the Kentucky legislature denying the right of the federal government to assume any power not specifically given it in the Constitution, and affirming the right of each state on its own initiative to nullify such action. While needed at the time, those resolutions contained germs of grave trouble to develop later into the Civil War. In 1800, the electoral vote was equally divided between Jefferson and Aaron Burr, throwing the election into the Federalist House. As chief opposition leader, Jefferson was bitterly hated, and the House inclined to give the election to Burr, which would have been a national calamity. At this point, Hamilton intervened. Distrusting Burr and recognizing Jefferson's devotion to the country's welfare, he influenced enough votes to make his enemy, Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States. Jefferson's inaugural address was a masterpiece, stating his whole philosophy of democracy. He pardoned all sedition law convicts, gradually removed the midnight judges, last-minute appointees of Adams, and sought to eliminate all aristocratic customs. His great achievement was the Louisiana Purchase. The year he took office, Spain ceded to Napoleon her claim to that empire extending from New Orleans to the Pacific Northwest. When Jefferson learned of this, he exclaimed, "We must marry ourselves to the British nation and fleet." He hoped, however, to buy New Orleans and some adjacent territory, an idea earlier urged, and sent Monroe to negotiate. Napoleon had not been able to shake the dominance of the British fleet, and finally offered to sell the whole territory to Jefferson for $16 million. For that sum of national small change, Jefferson bought the empire that made our greater America. He did it in direct violation of his expressed views of the constitutional powers of the federal government, taking as president the action he saw was necessary to the nation's welfare. His second election was almost unanimous, but the party split behind its leaders, as usually follows when a party takes office with too large a majority. Believing no generation should limit a subsequent one, Jefferson was anxious to pay off the national debt before leaving office. To accomplish that, he must avoid war, and so accepted grave humiliation to maintain peace at any price. He refused a third term, establishing the tradition founded by Washington, and left office saddened, but with the heart of the people still with him. His later life was given to the 16 years fight to establish the University of Virginia. He planned its simple but beautiful buildings, and as rector inaugurated educational reforms carried out nearly a century later in northern institutions. In the last year, Jefferson suffered increasing financial distress from a combination of causes, including the throng of visitors who came. He had to sell his beloved library, collected through 60 years. To keep the books together, he let Congress have it for about half its public auction value. A large gift from friends in other states enabled him to remain at Monticello. After his death, his daughter had to leave, and the great estate was sold for $10,000. So Jefferson died at Monticello, and strange to say, on July 4th, 1826, anniversary of the signing of his draft of the nation's birth charter. Stranger yet, John Adams died the same day in Massachusetts, and almost his last words were, "Thomas Jefferson still survives," but Jefferson had died several hours earlier. He wrote his own epitaph, which reads, "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the American Declaration of Independence, of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia." No mention of his other great services. Those were the three by which he wished to be remembered. Author of the American Declaration of Independence, philosopher of democracy for all time. Of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, father of our American religious liberty. And father of the University of Virginia, first of our statesmen to recognize fully the responsibility of the state for the education of the citizen under democracy. Jefferson thus stands for a few great simple ideas: freedom of speech and press, freedom in religion, freedom of person and conduct, ideas for which we must ever fight to keep the soul of democracy in our great, ever-growing, more powerful and centralized republic.
Jefferson, philosopher of democracy, has been the subject of another program in the series titled Lives of Great Men, presented by Dr. Edward Howard Griggs.